Dear colleagues and friends, I'm one of the first vice director of the High School Economics, and it's a great pleasure and great honor to introduce to you our distinguished speaker, who in fact needs no special introduction today, Professor Thomas Piketty. Professor Piketty obtained his first degree from, in mathematics and economics from École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Then he got his PhD in economics at École des Études en Sciences Sociales, and at the same time at London School of Economics. It was a joint program. Afterwards, he spent 3 years in Boston working at MIT, at Department of Economics, and then he came back to Paris to join CNRS, which is a French National Center, French National Center for Scientific Research. Correct. At the moment, Thomas Piketty is a professor at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales, and I'm pleased to say that 3 years ago, the president of this school was here, and he and the director of the High School of Economics signed an agreement on our cooperation. And above all, we have a number of graduates of this school with their doctoral degrees working at the High School of Economics. So today's lecture is a sort of a further contribution to our cooperation. At the same time, Thomas Piketty is a professor at the Paris School of Economics, and he was a director of this school for several years. He's also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, one more long-term partner of the High School of Economics, HSC. Also, he's a co-director World Top Income Database. He has many other titles, prizes, and many academic achievements. But he became really world famous after publishing his book, Capital 21st Century, which was published in French 2 years ago. Very soon it was translated to English and then to some other languages, and today we are happy to know that this book is available in Russian, and I have this volume in my hand, and I'm not just carrying it with me. I must say that I'm reading it, and I must tell you it's indeed a fascinating reading. Finally, I have to say that this event has been arranged by the Laboratory for Studies in Economic Sociology, Laboratory экономико-социологических исследований of the High School of Economics, the Center for French-Russian Studies in Moscow, Центр франко-российских исследований в Москве, and French Embassy. And let me express my sincere gratitude to our colleagues who make this event possible, and give the floor to Hélène Mila, the director of this center.
Здравствуйте, я буду по-русски, такой языковой разнообразие, буквально несколько слов. Я хочу выразить благодарность Тома Piketty за то, что он приехал в Москву. Как вы знаете, он всемирно известный, выдающийся экономист. Он очень занят, но тем не менее согласился приехать на 1,5 дня и прочитать даже 2 лекции. Так что спасибо за то, что согласился на такой лекционный марафон. Merci Thomas pour ce marathon de conférences. Я еще хочу поблагодарить, конечно, господина Радаева, и вообще хочу сказать, что очень важно наше сотрудничество. Центр франко-российских исследований, который уже существует в 2015 в Москве, позволяет французским коллегам-исследователям проводить здесь год, 2 года, заниматься в архиве, есть историки, социологи, литературоведы. То есть это междисциплинарный центр, и экономисты как раз здесь сидит у нас рядом. И мы очень тесно сотрудничаем с Высшей школой экономики, и мы вместе ведем семинар с социологией раз в месяц. Мы подали летнюю шоу вместе в этом году, и очень надеюсь, что будем продолжать этот очень тесный опыт. И, наконец, участвуем тоже в конференциях вместе. Вот. Я желаю вам очень интересной лекции. Я уверен, что после мы все выйдем из этой аудитории более умные и будем разбираться очень хорошо в экономике. Я знаю, потому что я уже слушала эту лекцию, которая была сегодня. Спасибо, спасибо вам всем.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your invitation. Well, I'm happy to show you myself on the screen. The slides will be even better if it is technically possible. Okay, thank you. Let me first, apologize that my the pronunciation of my English sounds a lot like French, and I hope you will be able to understand what I have to say. And, I'm sorry I'm not able to speak in Russian. Let me say how happy I am to be there in Moscow to present my work. I'm very happy that my book is now available in the Russian language, and so I will, in this presentation, present you a number of results from the book, and so that maybe you want to read it, or if you don't read it, at least you have some information, first-hand information on what's in the book. So let me also apologize for writing such a long book. This is really. But on the other hand, there are reasons why it is long. The main reason is that in this book, I have put together a lot of historical material which has been collected over the past 50 years with many co-authors. I should say very quickly that this book, I am the only one responsible for the mistakes that might be in the book, but I am certainly not the only one responsible for the historical data that I present. This really comes from a very collective international research project. I started working on the history of income and wealth distribution in France about 15 years ago, and then I was very fortunate to find very many collaborators at Kingston to do it in Britain, with Emmanuel Saez, who did the same for the US, with Facundo Alvaredo, who worked in Argentina, Spain, with Digital Energy in India, and this became a very international research project that is still going on. So we're still adding new countries and new data to the database. And so the book is really an attempt to propose a consistent interpretation of all of this database, but let me make very clear that we still know too little. I think we know a little bit more than we used to of these issues, but we are in a very imperfect and beginning field, and there are different ways to interpret the historical series and the historical material that we have found, so we have to be very modest, and we will hopefully know more in the future. Let me also say that today I will present a number of selected historical evolutions. The general objective of this research program is to put the study of the distribution back at the center of political economy. So I cannot present all the results today. I will just present a number of selected graphs. You can go on this website or on this other website to see more data. I'm sorry I cannot put the book online. My publisher will disagree, although I am sure it's possible to find it somewhere. But at least you can find all the data and all the graphs online so that you can have a good sense of what I am doing. So in particular, there's a big part of the data that I present in the book that comes from the World Top Income Database. So all the countries in red are already in the database. The countries in blue are entering the database, and I hope that Russia will be in blue at some point. So what does it mean to be in the database? It means that we try to use all the historical data on income inequalities that we could find. So usually the oldest source of information on income starts with the creation of the modern income tax. So for instance, in the United States, the federal income tax was created in 1913. And the first economist to use this data was Simon Kuznets in the 1950s, who was an American economist, a Ukrainian-born American economist, who moved to the US in the 20s, who was at the same time the first economist to compute national accounts for the US, GDP statistics, which after World War II were handed over to the official National Statistical Institute, but for a long time were computed by academics, by researchers. And then, after computing the first national income series for the US, Kuznets used this income tax data from 1913 to 1948 to compute the evolution of the share of national income going to the different social groups of the US distribution, the top 10%, bottom 50%, bottom 90%, etc. So Kuznets had only one country over a 35-year period between 1913 and 1948, this was a lot more than what we had before. So economists in the 19th century had been talking about inequality forever, Ricardo, Marx, but they had basically no data, or very little data, which puts strong limitations on what you can say, or actually it puts no limit on what you can say, and which is a problem. So at least Kuznets had data, and he came with a very powerful conclusion, which was a reduction of inequality, very strong reduction of inequality between 1913 and 1948. And from this came a very optimistic theory of inequality and development, which was very popular in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, which was known as the Kuznets curve. This was very popular in the West, because it's a very powerful political message when in advanced stages of economic development you have a natural reduction in inequality and then a stabilization at lower inequality level. So the powerful political message, especially in the Cold War context, was, please be patient, don't make mistake, in particular to all the newly independent countries that could be tempted by communism. The message was, please don't become communist, take your time, and, at some point, you will have growth and reduction in inequality. Now, what we've done in this project, in a way, is simply to extend the work of Kuznets to many more countries and many more years. So instead of having one country over 35 years, we have over 20 countries over an entire century. And as we can see, as we will see, this changes quite a lot the interpretation and the optimistic interpretation of Kuznets. And we will see that, in fact, there was really nothing natural in this reduction of inequality in the first half of the 20th century. So we come with a completely different interpretation of the dynamics of development and inequality. But still, we are pursuing Kuznets' work in the sense that this extension to more countries, more years, was never done before, I think largely for bad reason, because this kind of historical material look too economic or too technical for many historians and too historical for economists, so in the end nobody was really using it until recently. So that's the first part of the data that I use in the book. The second part of the data is more about wealth. So for wealth, we can go back older in time than for income, because the taxation of wealth, in particular at the time of transmission, at the time of inheritance, is much older than the taxation of income. So in many countries, in particular in France, you have an introduction of a modern inheritance tax at the time of the French Revolution, so we can go back to the archives to the early 19th century or late 18th century. So it's important, to realize that taxation is always more than taxation. It's also a way to produce information about income, about property, the registration of property, and the information you get is not perfect, but it's better than if you have no information at all. And one reason why Russia is difficult to study on this is that it's, as I will say in a minute, it's very difficult to access, to say the least, the income tax data, and also, of course, the transition from communism to capitalism came with a complete change in the very notion of income and property and capital, so it will not be possible, unfortunately, to show the kind of series that I will show for other countries. So in this presentation, I will try to go through the following 3 points. So the first point will be about income inequality, and then the other 2 points about wealth. First, about the return of what I call a patrimonial society with a very large value of wealth relative to income, and then the last point will be about the future of wealth concentration. But I will start with income. I should apologize for the fact that Russia doesn't play in my book as much of a role that I would like it to be. I mean, it's not that I'm not interested, but largely for data available reasons, it was not possible to study Russia. But some of the evolutions that I will show, I think, are very relevant for Russia, in particular when I will show you evolution about the evolution of private capital versus public capital. Of course, Russia is the most extreme example of transfer from public property to private property, and we will see to some extent that we have similar evolution, but less extreme in other countries as well. More generally, before I start with the 3 points, let me say a few words about what we know, or actually what we don't know about inequality in Russia as compared to the countries that I will show you, mostly US, Europe, Japan, in the following slides. I think there are reasons to believe that income and wealth concentration in Russia today is probably very high, although we don't really have good data to compare it to the historical series I will show you. One indicator, if you look at the very top of the distribution of wealth, is that billionaire wealth seems to be much larger. So here I'm just, the data I am putting here comes from this graph. So let me say right away, this is according to Forbes rankings. We just count the number of billionaires from each country, look at total billionaire wealth as a fraction of GDP. If we do that, this is what we get. So, it's between 5 and 10% of GDP in Europe, between 10 and 15% in the US, between 20-25% in Russia, and this corresponds to what everybody has in mind, which is that there's a concentration of very top wealth holders among a relatively small number of what have come to be called oligarchs in this country, or political oligarchs in other cultures. Now, let me say right away that this data is far from being perfect, and I don't want to make too much of it. I think it certainly captures something. The numbers of billionaires as a proportion of the population in these different countries seem more or less comparable, so I think these figures are more or less comparable, but this is relatively weak information. And I would prefer, the main conclusion is we don't really know. We are not really able to make comparison between the level of inequality today in Russia and other countries because of an extreme lack of transparency. I don't know if Russia is the most unequal country in the world, but it's certainly one of the least transparent. So that's a problem because it makes it very difficult to do any comparison. So in particular, it's almost impossible to access income tax data. Even simple tabulations indicating the number of taxpayers by income brackets. If some of you have seen the data, please send it to me. But Russia is a country with an income tax, but no income tax statistics. Just knowing how many taxpayers last year had between 1 million and 2 million rubles, 2 million and 3 million, 4 and 5. What was their total income? That would be completely anonymous. So but even this information is not publicly available. And I think, it's important in a country, to have a tax, even if the tax system is not working properly, and I would say especially if it is not working properly, you want to show the data at the national level, maybe at the local level as well, and in some cases we would realize that maybe the tax law is not being applied as much as it should, or in any case we'll be able to monitor how this is changing over time. This is important because in all the countries where we have studied, although the tax data is not perfect, it is a lot better than the household survey data. So in particular, the household survey data where you ask individuals about their income and wealth underestimates a lot inequality at the top. This is true for income, this is even more extreme for wealth. Now, for wealth, there's no, as you know, there's no inheritance tax in Russia, so there's no data at all on inherited wealth. So, you know, you cannot even make any form of comparison with other countries, and I think this is a problem, especially because, you know, capital flight is a problem. You know, as we all know, Russia has had huge trade surplus over the past 15 years. You know, it was almost 10% of GDP on average. Okay, so the goods and services going out of the country represent 10% of GDP more than the goods and services coming in the country. Right now it's a bit less than, it's more between 5 and 10% of GDP, but it used to be even more than 10% of GDP 10 years ago, so on average over a 15-year period, 10% of GDP. Now, where has the money gone? This is a serious issue, because if you look at the increase in foreign reserves, it is much less than the cumulated value of the current account and the trade surplus. And what many people believe, of course, is that a lot has gone, you know, in offshore, basically, in Switzerland or in other tax havens, and in the end, it's not benefiting the Russian people. So I think this is a serious issue, and the problem of transparency about income and wealth is a problem in every country, not only in Russia. You know, it's also a problem in France, it's a problem everywhere. But I think probably even more than other countries, Russia will need more transparency about income and wealth dynamics. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have, you know, informed political conversation about inequality, taxation. Well, you know, it's always difficult to have a quiet discussion about taxation. You know, in every country, people get excited very quickly, but if you don't have any data information, it's even more difficult. So that being said, you know, let me return to my 3 points where Russia will not be as present as I would like it to be. And let me start with the first point about the long-run dynamics of income inequality. So here the main conclusion would be this idea of the end of the Kuznets curve, the end of this optimistic view about the long-run dynamics of inequality. So let me start with the country for which the Kuznets curve idea started, which is the United States. Okay? So this is a simple graph showing the evolution of income inequality in the United States. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10% of the distribution. And so you see the decline in inequality during the first half of the 20th century, which is exactly what Kuznets found. Okay, so Kuznets wrote in the 1950s, and this is what he found. And we agree with Kuznets. You know, we use the same data. He didn't have Excel, but he did the computation right, everything, and we agree. The difference is that we have another 60, 70 years of data, which of course changes quite a bit the perspective on the long-run evolution. And also we had many more countries, so we can better interpret what we see. But already, you know, what you can see is that so look, the orders of magnitude is that, you know, you go from either, you know, 30% of total income for the top 10%, 50% when you have the highest level of inequality. So just to put these numbers in perspective, you know, if you had complete equality, by definition, the income share of the top 10% would be 10%. And if you had complete inequality, it would be 100%. So going from 30 to 50%, well, these are the typical orders of magnitude that you see in advanced countries. Now, there are countries in the world where it could be even higher. You know, in Brazil or in South Africa, you can have 60% and 65% of the total income to the top 10%. So it makes a big difference as compared to 30. Now, where is Russia today? There, between 30, 40, 50, 60, I'm not able to tell you. You know, it's probably closer to the 50% for trade, but you know, it's, again, I'm not able to make a proper comparison given the data we have. On the basis of the billionaire data, it would be even higher than the US in terms of inequality, but on the other hand, this billionaire data is imperfect, that's only part of inequality. A lot of this inequality is due to inequality of labor income rather than inequality of capital income and property, so we cannot really make the comparison. Now, returning to the US, so you can see in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you have a very stable situation, which corresponds to a sort of ideal situation of post-war balanced growth. You know, when you have a stable share going to the top 10%, it means that everybody grows at the same speed. So like in 1960 or 1970, if you have a 3% GDP growth, it means that everybody grows at 3%. You know, the average income of the top 10% grows at 3%, the average income of the bottom 90% grows at 3%. So in a way, you don't really care about inequality, because you have rich people, poor people, middle people, but everybody goes up at the same speed, so you care about having more growth. Now, starting around 1980, it's a very different situation, where you have this huge increase in inequality. So you can see that when you add capital gains, it becomes very cyclical, because capital gains, so this is income you get by selling your capital, typically at the stock market, your equity. So, of course, 2001 and 2 or 2008 and 9 are not good times to exercise your stock options and to make large capital gains. But then after the crisis, it starts again, and you can see that even without the capital gains, you have a very strong trend, and 2012, which is the latest data for this draft, is already higher inequalities in 2007, right before the financial crisis. Okay, so the financial crisis in itself doesn't seem really to affect the long-term trend, because the 1928 high point, came with the 1929 financial crisis, and then there was a huge decline in inequality. But this is because after the Depression, you had World War II, and you had a complete change in policy, fiscal policy, social policy, that so far you don't have. So financial crisis in itself, if they don't trigger a change in political and social regimes, have no reason to change the trend. Now, in this presentation, I will sometimes show you annual series so that you can see all the short-term chaos that comes with the business cycle and financial crisis. And sometimes I will show you decennial averages so that you can focus on long-term evolution. So next graph, I will show you the same evolution with decennial averages for the US, with the same general pattern, comparing with the evolution for Europe. Okay, so you have again the same measure of inequality. So Europe, as you know, it's a complicated continent, so here it's really Western Europe, because this is a GDP-weighted average of Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Sweden. And so what you can see, so you have again the U-shape for the US. Now for Europe, what's interesting is that you have a reversal between inequality between Europe and the US over the long run. Europe used to be more inegalitarian than the US, and now the US has become a lot more inegalitarian. So in particular, in the recent decades, you have rising inequality everywhere. The share going to the top 10% is also increasing in Europe, but much less strongly than in the US. And so we want to understand why. That's an interesting piece of evidence in itself. If we put, if you go to the World Top Income Database website, you will see all the detailed series for the different individual European countries, but they tend to be relatively close together as compared to the US, so let me simplify and compare Europe to the US. If you put Japan on the picture, which is the third part of the rich world, if you want, you can see that it's in between Europe and the US, closer to Europe in some ways, but you clearly, you have rising inequality everywhere in recent decades, but at very different speed. So how can we explain this? Well, you can think of different explanations. It's certainly a combination of explanations. What's important to have in mind is that mostly at this stage, this is due to rising inequality of labor income, although rising inequality of capital income and property is starting to play an important role and probably will play a bigger role in the future, but at this stage, rising inequality of labor income has been the most important part. Now, this itself is due to a mixture of factors. So the standard economic explanation for change in inequality involves changing supply and demand for skills. So the basic economic story is, okay, you have a race between supply of skill and demand for skill, or between education and technology, if you want. So you have skill-biased technical change that is requiring more and more skills over time. At the same time, the education system is supplying more skills, but depending on which one is rising fastest, you can have a decline or an increase in inequality. In addition, if you have globalization and new countries entering the world labor market, a standard explanation for rising inequality in the north is to say, okay, you have all this, China enters the world labor market, so you have all these low-skill, medium-skill workers who are competing with the lower-skill and medium-skill workers in Europe and North America and Japan, and this is why you have rising inequality. Now, the problem with this explanation, I think it's part of the explanation, but it's too simple, because if this was the only explanation, then, globalization happened not only in the US, it also happened in Japan, in Sweden, in Germany, and so you should have the same evolution everywhere, which you don't have at all. You have very different evolution. So you need other explanations. So you need, for instance, if you want to stick to the pure labor and supply story that economists like, you need to explain why you have more unequal access to skill and more unequal supply of skill in the US. And so here the obvious explanation is, rising tuition fees, insufficient public investment in a public university system. So in the US, there are very good top universities, as we all know, but the bottom 50% of the population, not only they don't go to Harvard, but they go to, the quality of the high school and community college they go to is really very far away from the huge investment that is made to the best universities. So the inequality in the educational system is arguably even stronger than in Europe or in Japan. This can play a role. Now, this is not the only explanation, because at the very top of the distribution, you see an unprecedented rise of top managerial compensation in the US, particularly, which is very difficult to explain simply on the basis of education and skills, because it's, it's not that the people in the top 1% or top 0.1% have a lot more skills or education than the next 1 or 2%. So I think it will be a bit naive to believe that when top managers get paid $10 million instead of 1, this is because their skills and their productivity has increased from 1 to 10. I think this is we live in a world where the way the labor market operates and the pay determination process operates, particularly at the top of the distribution, depends a lot more on the institution and the rules and the corporate governance system. And there's very little evidence that this huge top managerial pay corresponds to an increase in performance or job creation. I think it has a lot more to do with changing incentives and corporate governance system. In particular, as we will see by the end of this talk, the US is the country where the progressivity of the income tax has been reduced the most over this period, and this has probably increased. This has been one of the channels through which there has been an increase in the strong incentives for top managers to bargain very aggressively over higher pay. Changing labor market institutions, declining role of unions, falling minimum wage in the US probably also played a role. Now, whatever the combination of explanation between education, labor market, corporate governance, fiscal policy, the general conclusion is that institution and policy matter, and that in the end, you have globalization, but then you have different ways to organize globalization. And different institutions and policy allow different countries to make broader groups in the population to benefit from globalization. So just to illustrate this a bit more, let me show you two simple graphs. Okay, this is the evolution of the minimum wage in the US and in France. So this is all expressed in dollars or euros of 2013. And I have put €1 equal $1.2, which is roughly the purchasing power parity. So you can sort of compare, so you can see that the minimum wage used to be a lot higher in the US. The minimum wage was first created in the US in the 1930s. It was the first country to create the national minimum wage. It was very high for a long time. Then, you see, when it goes down during the Reagan period, this is because of inflation each year. Okay? So this is in fact a fixed minimum wage. You don't have automatic indexation for minimum wage in the US. So when you have inflation of 2, 3, 4% per year, each year you lose in purchasing power. Then when you have Clinton or when you have Obama, you have some increase in the minimum wage. But Obama earlier this year proposed to increase the federal minimum wage to $10 an hour. It is $7.2 right now. But this will not happen because the US Congress doesn't want this to happen, so it will not go to $10. Now it's important to have in mind that even if this was decided to go to $10, this would just be back to the 1960s. Okay, so in the 1960s, the real value of the federal minimum wage was $10.5 an hour, expressed in dollars of 2013. Okay? Which is really quite surprising, you know, to see a country over half a century with a decline in the absolute value of the minimum wage. And particularly, you know, in the 60s, it's not that there was a lot of unemployment. You know, 95% of the labor force had a job, but with a higher minimum wage than today. So, you know, of course, it was a different country in the sense the population was much less important than today. The labor force was smaller, but you know, still, now in France, you have a very different evolution over the years. This is just an example that you know different policies can make a difference. Now, increasing the minimum wage is certainly not the only way to reduce inequality, because if you just increase the minimum wage and don't invest in skills and education and high productivity jobs, that's not going to be enough. So, this kind of policy is complementary to investment in education. Now, look at this graph to illustrate inequality in access to education in the US. So this comes from a recent study. It's actually not in my book. This comes from a recent study by Raj Shetty and Emmanuel Saez in the US. We were able to match the income tax declaration of the parents with the social security numbers of the students. So this was computed for college students aged 18 to 21 in the US. This was measured with data for 2008 to 2012. So this is like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So this is today. Okay, so this is the situation today in the US. So what you have, so this is the parental income rank, and this is the probability to be in college. And this is the average point. So now what you get, I think is very striking. You know, so first you have almost a straight line, and it's almost the first diagonal. So you go almost from 0 to 100. Well, not quite. If your parents are poor, you still have a 20% chance to make it. And if your parents are rich, you know, in the top 10%, you only have a 90% probability to make it. Okay? So you don't go from 0 to 100, you go from 20 to 90. But still, you know, this is very striking, because this is, you know, an example where you see, you know, there's really a huge gap between the official discourse about mobility and equal opportunity and meritocracy, etc., and the reality of what's happening. So I think it's important, you know, there's always a lot of imagination by the elites to justify inequality and to say that everybody has a chance, that we live in an equal opportunity society. But I think it's important, you know, to put these claims under public scrutiny. And that's why it's important to have transparency, to have access to this kind of data in order to see, not only for the tax system, but also for the education system, the social spending, you know, to know who benefits from what and who has access to what. And remember that this is only part of the inequality, because the people who go to university at the top, they don't go to the same university as these people. Okay? So in my book, I give some data where, you know, the average income of Harvard University students right now corresponds to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of family income, which doesn't mean that there's no student from below the top 2 that goes to Harvard, but it means something very precise, that the students who come from below the top 2 are sufficiently few, and the students who come from the top 2 are sufficiently high within the top 2 that the overall average is as if all students had been picked at random within the top 2%, which is, again, quite striking. Now, this is quite extreme in the US, but you know, it's not enough to have a free education like in France or in a number of European countries to change this completely. So yeah, I did the same computation for France. If you do it for Sciences Po, which is an elitist French institution in Paris, you get that the average income of the parents corresponds to the average income of the top 9%, 9 to 10% of the population. So it's a bigger group than the top 2%, but you know, it's still, this is still quite extreme. So, which means that you have some students who come from below the top 10, but those who come from the top 10 come from the top 1 and 2 or 3, so the overall average is as if they all came picked at random within the top 10 or 9% of the population. So, and you know, in France, you know, we are able sometimes to, you know, to put 3 times more public resources per student in the very elitist schools than what we put in the normal standard university curriculum where the most disadvantaged students go to. So, you know, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy around meritocracy in every country, not only in the US. So let me be very clear about that. The inequality in access to education may be particularly extreme to the US, but it's not that other countries, in particular European countries, are doing perfectly well. Now let me move to Wales. because I have talked about inequality of labor income. Now I want to move to accumulation of wealth. So, of course, inequality of wealth is partly the consequence of inequality in labor income. So everything I have said about the determinants of inequality of labor income, in particular access to education, minimum wage, etc., is going to have an impact in the long run on inequality of wealth. But wealth accumulation involves more than simply inequality of income. So, in particular, I will first argue that an important evolution that we see in the long run is a return of what I call a patrimonial or wealth-based society with higher ratio of wealth to income that we used to. To some extent, it corresponds to a natural phenomenon due to aging, where you tend to accumulate more wealth in a society with slow population growth. But it also involves other aspects, and in particular, what I try to argue in my book is that what I call the metamorphosis of capital, the development of new forms of property, creates new challenges, either in terms of housing, price bubbles, or immaterial capital regulation, or patent laws, worker co-determination. So there's a whole set of legal and institutional issues to regulate the distribution of property, which change in nature over time as the nature of capital is changing, and which is, it's important to have this overall evolution in mind. So in particular, the first broad evolution I want to show you, in every European country where we have data, you can see that the total value of capital relative to national income has gone through enormous transformation in the long run. So you have different levels. You can see that the value in Germany, which is below France and Britain, that's due to the fact that the real estate price in Germany are lower than France and Britain for various reasons, which includes the institutional aspect of rent regulation, different geography of the country, and most importantly, the lower level in Germany include the lower market value of companies, lower stock market capitalization, which is certainly not necessarily bad in itself. It involves the fact that you have this worker co-determination system, so that the shareholders are not the complete, or at least not the only owner of the company, which reduces the market value of capital, but not necessarily the social value of capital, which can be two very different things. But I cannot talk about all these different aspects of comparison between countries. Let me just focus on the broad long-term evolution, which is that even if the level in some countries like Germany is below some other countries, you have clearly a strong reconstruction of the capital stock in the post-war period. This is a very long-term evolution. Now, it's important to have in mind that this reflects the fact that there was a huge destruction of capital and very little investment during this period. So during this period, between 1910 and 1950, a huge part of the private saving in Europe was used not to accumulate new capital, but rather to pay for the war, which itself was used to destroy the rest of the capital stock, which is a sad story, but this is the story of the time. But it also, if we try to do decomposition, about 1/3 of this fall is due to destruction, 1/3 to lack of investment, and 1/3 to change in the regulation of capital. So when you have rent control in 1950, 1960, this reduces the market value of capital, or other policies to regulate the stock market. And this is, again, this is not necessarily bad in itself. So that's why we need to open the black box of capital. So here you have the same broad evolution, but over an even longer period for Britain. And you can see that it's really the rise of housing in the recent period, of the value of housing, but not necessarily the volume or the quality of housing, which explains a big part of the evolution. So agricultural land has disappeared. Well, it is still there, but it is not worth much as a fraction of total capital. So, you have a complete transformation in the nature of capital. You had a lot of foreign assets in Britain. Britain owned, at the eve of World War I, almost 2 years of national income in the rest of the world. They have nothing in 1950, largely because these foreign assets were sold in order to pay for the war. So you have a complete change in the nature of property. but in the end, at the end of the period, you get back to what I call this new form of patrimonial society with a very high level of wealth capitalization, but with different form of assets than what you have before. You have comparable evolution in France. If we look at more countries in the recent period, you can see that you have a general trend. So this is private wealth in a number of rich countries. So these are the top 8 developed countries in the world. Now, here I return to annual series so that you can see all the short-term variation, like the Japanese housing bubble and stock market bubble at the end of the 1980s. But what's interesting is that you have a general trend. You start, all countries have private wealth between 2 and 3 years of national income at the beginning of the period, and all countries have between 4 and 7. Now, that's important to have in mind because sometimes in economic textbook, you hear that the ratio of wealth to income or capital to output should be a constant. But, as you can see, this doesn't really look like a constant. So you should be careful with this textbook because, economic textbook sometimes, in economics, when you don't know much about something, we just assume it's a constant, which, of course, if you have only one data point, everything is a constant, but when you have more data, in fact, there's no reason why it should be a constant. You should keep in mind that even in the simplest economic model of capital accumulation, with a one good sector and perfect competition, no bargaining power of capital owners and workers, and the textbook model, in fact, any level, any ratio of capital to output could be an equilibrium. It all depends on how much you save and invest relative to the underlying population growth and productivity growth of the economy. Now, if you move to more complicated model, where you have a multi-sector model, and the relative price of housing plays a big role, where you have bargaining power between owners of companies and workers that's changing over time, decline of unions, financial deregulation, globalization, everything else, then you have even more reason for this big change. A final explanation for this evolution is that over this period of time, you have a gradual transfer of property from the public sector to the private sector. So let me move to this graph, which is the same as before, except that I have put public capital in addition to private capital. So what is public capital? So this is, capital or wealth in this graph is defined always as a net wealth concept. So this is always the difference between what you own, assets, which can be real estate, business assets, financial assets, minus debt, minus financial liability. So public capital is the difference between all the public assets, which can be public companies, public buildings, schools, hospitals, whatever, minus the public debt. So what you can see is that first, that public capital is always less than private capital. Well, this is because these countries have never been communist countries, but we all knew this, but it's important to check from time to time that we didn't make anything wrong. So you can see, these countries, you always have more private capital. If you have the same graph from Russia, I don't have the same graph from Russia, but I can already tell you and you already know what you will find. For Russia, you will go from public capital, which was everything, to public capital, which is very small today, and private capital from very small to very high. Now, to some extent, you have the same general evolution, but in a less extreme way in these countries, in the sense that, at the beginning of the period, why do you have higher public capital than today? The decline in public capital just corresponds to the fact that over this period, you have privatization of public assets. Many public firms were privatized, and you have an increase in private debt, in public debt. So if you have less public assets, more public debt, of course you decline. So you look at Italy. Italy is an interesting case, because Italy, you have, according to this, all the official national accounts of the different countries. I did not invent anything. So for Italy, it's negative. So why is it negative? Well, this means that even if the Italian government was to sell all the public assets, all the schools and hospitals and all public assets, that would not be enough to reimburse the public debt. Okay, so the public debt will still be minus 60-70% of GDP. Now, Italy is an interesting case because Italy is at the bottom of the class for public capital and at the top of the class for private capital, which is obvious because someone has to buy the public debt and has to buy the privatized public asset. So there is part of this evolution of private wealth is just due to a transfer from public to private wealth, although it's only partly a transfer. I don't know if you can read these numbers here, but in Italy, private capital rose from 240 to 680% of national income, whereas public capital only declined from plus 20 to minus 70. So if you want, the transfer from public to private wealth explains maybe 1/4 of the total rise in private capital. So it's important, but it's not all of the evolution. Now, if we are doing the same for ex-communist countries, of course, it would be much more extreme. You will have a much more direct transfer through different forms of privatization, voucher privatization, different techniques of privatization, but which in the end led to a transfer of public to private property. Now, let me say very clearly that a transfer from public to private property is certainly not necessarily bad in itself. In some cases, this can be justified to have private management. But, there are limits to this. You can see that when you have negative public wealth, negative is really very small, and maybe this is too small. I was telling the case of Italy, even if you sell all the public schools, public hospitals, that will not be enough to repay the public debt. Now, I'm certainly not recommending that Italy should do that, but it's important to have in mind that, many people would be shocked if we had to pay rent to the private owners of the schools and hospitals to which we send our children. But in a way, this is already what we are doing, because when you're paying interest payment on the public debt, and the value of the public debt is higher than the value of public asset, in the end you can end up paying more in interest payment than what you will pay in rent to the owners of the schools and hospitals. So this is a bit more abstract because this goes through the financial intermediation system and interest payment, but in the end this is the same. And to be very concrete, Italy right now is paying 4-5% of GDP in interest payment each year, whereas the total budget of the entire university system is of the order of 1% of GDP. So there's 5 times more taxpayer money. And this is all internal debt. That's also important to have in mind. If you take all these countries together, they own each other's debt, but their overall net foreign asset position is positive, not negative. They own more assets in the rest of the world than the rest of the world owns them. So that's important to have in mind. This creates new policy challenges, such as the restructuring of public debt, which has happened many times in the past and which could happen again in Europe in the future. But the general lesson is that it's important to put these questions in historical perspective if we want to address them properly. Now, let me move to the last part of what I want to say, which has to do with the future of wealth concentration. Okay, so far, I have talked a lot about the total value of wealth, private wealth, public wealth, but I didn't talk much about the inequality in wealth. Because after all, you could have a very high ratio of wealth to income, but with a perfectly egalitarian society where everybody owns the same share in the national wealth. So, then having a high wealth to income ratio is not bad in itself. It could just correspond to aging society, and that's partly what's happening. Except that at the same time, we also have a lot of inequality in the distribution of wealth, and inequality in wealth has increased in recent decades. Now, one of the determinants of the long-run evolution of wealth concentration, as I argue in my book, is the gap between the net of tax rate of return to capital and the growth rate, and to the extent that we will have higher net of tax rate of return to capital in the future than what we had during the 20th century due to various shocks and tax policy. This is a force that can lead to higher inequality of wealth in the future. So let me show you some data illustrating this. So this comes again from the Forbes rankings of billionaires. Let me say right away that this data is not particularly reliable, and I am a bit ashamed to show you this data to you, but I would prefer to show you data from Eurostat or the IMF or official statistical agencies. The problem is that you wouldn't have the data because you don't have the kind of transparency and automatic transmission of information about cross-border financial assets and banking information that would allow a public statistical institution to produce that kind of data. So at this stage, we have to do with what we have, in particular regarding the very top of the world distribution of wealth. So let's see what we can learn from this. So I started in 1987 because this is when the Forbes magazine started to publish their world ranking of billionaires. And so usually what people do in the press every year when you have this new ranking of billionaires is people say, okay, we have more and more billionaires every year. But, it's not too surprising in a growing world economy that we have more and more billionaires every year. So here what I do is slightly more sophisticated, which is to take a fixed fraction of the world population, because the world population itself is also rising over time, and to look at how the average wealth of this group has been changing over time. And so, as you can see, average wealth at the top has been rising at 6 to 7% per year in real terms after deduction of inflation, which is 3 to 4 times faster than average wealth, average income. So, world GDP has been rising at 3.3% per year over the same period. This is also the kind of world GDP growth that we're having now. Well, now it's a bit less than 3%, but like 3 to 3.5%. This is what we have. It's important to have in mind that world adult population growth has been taking more than half of this growth over this period. Okay, so that the per adult average world income has increased at only 1.4% over this period, in spite of the huge growth in China and many other countries. So, population growth is not is supposed to go to zero in the 21st century according to demographic projection, but it's not there yet. It's still large. In particular because of aging, but also because some countries are still growing quite fast. Average wealth has been going up at 2.1%, which is a bit faster than 1.4%. This corresponds to the rise in the wealth income ratio that I have shown you before. But now at the top, this has been rising a lot faster. Now, clearly, this cannot continue forever. And sure, this will not continue forever, because if you had forever average wealth at the top that was rising 3 to 4 times faster than average wealth in the world, then in the long run you would have 100% of world wealth going to billionaires, which everybody would argue, would agree is too much, it would be too much. So, and I'm not saying it will go to 100%, I'm sure it will stop before that. Now, where will it stop exactly? Nobody knows, and that's a concern, because let me make clear that, of course you have mobility in the distribution. Of course, these are not the same people. In 1987, the top billionaires, according to Forbes, are Japanese billionaires, which everybody has forgotten their name. And in 2013, you have Carlos Slim in Mexico, or Bill Gates, but the fact that you have this mobility, that you have some people going down, some people going up, in itself does not explain why average wealth at the top is growing so fast. Because if we were in an equilibrium of the world distribution of wealth, this downward mobility and upward mobility effect should more or less compensate each other, and so that the average wealth at the top is rising more or less at the same speed as average wealth for the rest of the distribution, which is what you need to have in the very, very long run. So here there's something unusual that is happening, which by definition cannot continue forever. So the question is, why is this happening? Again, the idea that this is happening because you have a lot of entrepreneurial innovation, this cannot be the explanation, because this makes some people go up, some people go down, but the two effects in the long run equilibrium should compensate each other. So you need something else. Privatization over this period certainly played a role. So you have a big part of the new top wealth owners in the world. Like you take Carlos Slim in Mexico, he became the owner of most of the telecom industry in Mexico when it was privatized. It's not that he invented the cell phone. It was largely a transfer of public property at very low prices. And of course, if you take the Russian billionaires, they did not invent oil fields or gas fields. They just became owners of a big part of public property at very cheap prices. And so, the good news is that this will not happen again, because there's not much left to privatize. So this is an important force driving this. This should stop. Now, there are probably other forces as well. One is that with financial deregulation, you probably have rising inequality in access to high financial returns. Okay, so let me show you, this data. This comes from university endowments in the US. So I'm not showing this to you to depress you, and the only reason I'm showing this to you is because at least US universities publish data on their endowment. So at least we know what these people are doing. We know how much wealth they have. We know how they invest it. And we know why they get the rate of return they get, which we don't know for the Forbes people. For the Forbes people, we really don't know anything. So I'll show you the data because we have to say something. But here at least this is much more better quality data. So what do we see? So I look at all 850 US universities over the longest period of time for which we have data, 1990 to 2010. So we see that they are all doing very well, 8.2% on average. This is a real return after deduction of inflation, after deduction of all management fees, administrative expenses, advising fee, etc. So that's quite good. So clearly US universities, they are not buying US treasury bonds. Okay, I don't know why some countries in the world buy US treasury bonds, but this is not what US universities have been doing for the recent decade. They have very sophisticated financial investment. And the higher the initial endowment, the more sophisticated the investment. So if you take Harvard, they have an endowment right now of over $40 billion. They spend, how do they get this return of 10%? Well, they invest in much more sophisticated financial products than you will be able to invest your money. And the way they do this is by paying a lot of financial advisor, financial fees, but because they have a very high initial endowment, they can afford doing that. So right now, Harvard, they spend only 0.3% of their endowment each year in financial advice. But 0.3% of 40 billion is more than 100 million each year. So if you can spend 100 million each year to pay for financial advice, even if these people are costly to pay, this is a good group of financial advisors. And if this allows you to get a return of 10 instead of 8 or 6, it's worth it. Now, if you have an endowment of 100 million, which is already good, it's much more than the endowment of the Paris School of Economics, I can tell you. But you're not going to spend 100 million each year in financial advice because you will not have any capital left at the end of the year. Okay? And if you have 10,000 rubles or 100,000 euros, you can ask advice to your brother-in-law or something like this, but probably that's not going to get you very far. Okay? And so, when we talk about R is bigger than G, it's important to realize that not everybody gets the same R. So again, in the textbook model of economics, in principle, if you have a perfect financial intermediation, this should mean that everybody is able to get the same return. So, the textbook model is you go to your bank with 10,000 euros and, the next morning it will get invested in China and you get the best return on the planet. But the real world doesn't seem to work like this. So some people are able through sophisticated financial derivatives, commodity derivatives, and all sorts of sophisticated products to get much, much higher returns. So what would the solution be? Well, the ideal solution would be to have more transparency about how the different wealth groups are doing, and then to be able to adjust the tax rate that we are asking to the different wealth groups, depending on what's the long-run distribution of wealth we want to have. If you have, if the very top wealth groups are growing at 6 to 7% per year or 8% per year, you cannot say that 1 or 2% or even 3% or 4% or more wealth tax rate is going to kill them. Now, if after we introduce this kind of increased transparency regime and progressive wealth tax, we find that the top groups are not rising faster than the average, then I will be happy to conclude that we don't need very progressive taxation. But that's why transparency is important, so we can adapt our policies to what we see. So is this change in tax policy, is this going to happen? Well, let me conclude by saying that the history of taxation is complicated. And sometimes what we see is not what we expect to see. So this is a short summary of the history of top income tax rate in 4 countries, US, UK, Germany, France. So you can see that 1 century ago, there was no income tax, and many people were saying that the progressive income tax would never happen. And finally it happened. And it happened in a fairly spectacular way. You can see in particular that in the US, in the UK, you have very, very high top income tax rate for a very long time. So in the US, if you make the average between 1930 and 1980, you have an average a top tax rate of 82%. Okay. So very progressive taxation of income was invented in the US and to some extent in the UK, certainly not in France or in Scandinavia, and certainly not in the Soviet Union, because in the Soviet Union with direct control over primary income distribution, you don't really need progressive taxation, so there was very limited progressive taxation, if any, under the Soviet Union. So you can see that you have this huge variation. So this is for top income tax rate. After Reagan in the US, you have this huge reduction going down to 28% in 1986. But if anything, the productivity growth rate of the US economy were higher in the 50s, 60s, 70s than they have been since then. So I know many people are not ready for a quiet discussion on this, but I think it's important to look back at this data and to reevaluate these lessons of history. Many people are not even aware of the fact that this has existed. Okay, so you have this for the income tax. This is for the top inheritance tax rate. So you can see again that in the US and the UK for a very long time. So this is the top tax rate applying to the largest inheritance. Okay? So in Russia right now it is exactly 0% because there's no inheritance tax, which is 0% is very small for a tax rate. And you can see that you have all these capitalist countries for a century which have had top tax rate of 20, 30, 50%. If you look today, you have about 40% in all countries. In Japan, which I have not put in the graph, it was just raised from 40 to 50%. Japanese government or Cameron in Britain or Merkel in Germany, they are not particularly left-wing, but I don't see anybody asking for 0% inheritance tax rate or 13% income tax rate, which is what we have in Russia right now. So I think it's important to be aware of the fact that there are different ways to organize taxation and progressive taxation in capitalist countries. It's interesting to see also that the US and the UK use progressive taxation much more intensively than France and Germany, partly because in France and Germany the redistribution of wealth was done through other means. Destruction of wealth during the war, a lot of inflation, nationalization also played a bigger role. But by and large, I think progressive taxation is at least better than destruction or inflation, and so it's interesting to see that the only time when Germany has very high top income tax rate is in 1946 to 1948, which is so this is true for inheritance taxation. This is even more true for income taxation. Look, 1946 to 1948, Germany has a 90% top income tax rate. This is when the tax policy of Germany is set by the Americans. Okay? This is when you have the Allied Control Council in West Germany, which in practice was ruled by the Americans. We were choosing the tax policy of Germany. And when when West Germany gets its sovereignty back in 1949, they quickly reduced the tax rate to about 50% in the 50s, and they want to get away from this crazy American tax rate of 90%. Okay. And this is the same thing in Japan. In Japan, you also have a 90% tax rate in 1946-48, and then it will. Now, what's interesting is that the Americans were not doing this to punish the Germans or the Japanese, because they were doing the same thing at home. So, in the American view of the time, this was considered, this very high tax rate were considered as part of the civilization package, if you want. You have the democratic institution, together with the fiscal institutions that will prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy with extreme concentration at the top. So I know that this can seem like ancient history to you, and but this is not so old. And so I think this is part of our common history. And when we look at the future and how to organize a progressive taxation in a country like Russia in the future, Well, I think, it's important to realize that what Russia is doing right now in terms of progressive taxation is pretty extreme by historical standards. We've not seen that for an entire century, since the 19th century in any major developed country. And, the evidence is that this can lead and perpetuate a pretty extreme concentration of wealth and income, and that it's possible, not only it's possible to grow and develop with more progressive taxation of income and wealth, but I think by and large this is desirable in order to have a more inclusive development path. Let me conclude. The general conclusion, I guess, of all my presentation is that the history of income and wealth inequality is not only an economic history, it is a deeply political, social and cultural history. It involves deep change in ideology, belief system, national identities, sharp reversal. It's interesting to see that the US historically largely introduced very progressive taxation, partly because they didn't want to become as unequal as Europe. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe had more concentration of wealth, and the US didn't want to become like this, which is, of course, from the point of view of today, the perceptions and the realities have changed completely. But countries need to tell stories and need narratives about their own relation with inequality and what they want to do with respect to others. I think, in a way, both Marx and Kuznets were wrong in the sense that you have powerful forces pushing in the direction of rising, reducing inequality. Which one dominates really depends on the institution policies that different societies choose to adopt. And the ideal solution involves a broad combination of inclusive institutions, including progressive taxation of income, wealth, and carbon, which I didn't really talk much about today, education, social labor laws, financial transparencies, co-determination, and economic democracy also play a role. So thanks a lot for your attention, and sorry for being so long.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this very stimulating talk. Now, dear colleagues, we turn to discussion. I will be arranged in two parts. First, will be regular academic discussion, and second, we've been asked to leave a special time for the journalists, because I'm here in this room, and we would be pleased to do that. So now, the floor is open for your questions and comments. Please make them brief. Yes, please.
Roman Novotny, the one in this room who actually read the book, and so it's pretty long, so I have questions, and all the comments, go directly to read. First question is about your methodology. You use different sources and different data, and sometimes it's very questionable, it can be compared to each other. For example, you use both cross-sectoral servers and also texts on real estate as two different sources, like they can give very different results. For example, in England, one source gives that 10% of most of the updated 71% of wealth, but the other source is only 40%. So the difference is great. If you can compare each other, it's like some up oranges and apples. Also, there is another source of comparison that's Luxembourg Income Study, and they also are very interesting story on global equality. They study not only countries with each other, but all the households of the world, and they see that global inequality is declining, and it is really in the last 7 years declined from 69 to 65. They predicted that it will decline before that. So we need to Also, it's very strange to wish both rising taxes and having more transparency, because if you start rising taxes, which will hide their assets, and that will lessen the transparency. That is actually a difficult problem. And the last one is that also due to advantage, countries you have different trends. For example, they see that in France quality is actually lessening, declining. In Germany it was pretty the same in 2004, and that right. So we have very different trends in different European Western countries. So all of them are capitalist countries. So I see that doesn't really go here. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for this question. So let me start with a question on global inequality, which I think is very, very important. So if you look at the global distribution of income between individuals in the world, individuals in Russia, in France, in the US, in China, in India, and you put all of these individuals together, then indeed you have very contradictory forces. Basically, you have a reduction of inequality between countries, with China catching up with rich countries in particular, and at the same time you have increasing inequality within countries. And I think there's no contradiction. Both are happening at the same time. And so I think there's no disagreement about this. And in fact, my book it actually starts with this. Chapter 1 of the book, so you don't need to go very far. It's exactly about convergence between countries. It's the first graph, I think. You see the decline in inequality between countries. So there's absolutely no disagreement about this. Now, does this imply that we don't care about inequality within country? No, I don't think so. I think it's possible to have a reduction of inequality between countries with catching up of emerging countries, and at the same time try to reduce inequality within countries. For instance, this very unequal access to education in the US. Is this good? No, I don't think that's good. Do we need to have this because China is converging with the US? Of course not. So there's no contradiction between the fact that there are good things in globalization, in particular the convergence from emerging countries, but we can do even better by having better policies. Let me also say that inequality is a concern not only in the US or in Europe, but also in China, or in Russia for that matter. You have a lot of countries emerging, or countries that have been in transition after communism, where inequality has increased to a level which is a concern. So then, one way to regulate inequality, sometime in Russia or sometime in China, is to say, you put in jail a couple of billionaires from time to time. But I don't think this is a very efficient way to regulate inequality. So you're saying taxation is not very transparent? Well, okay, but I think it's better. In the end, I think taxation, progressive taxation, of course it can create a distortion, but it's a much more civilized manner to regulate inequality. So, I think that's important not only for rich developed countries, but also for emerging countries and ex-communist countries. Now, you had a couple of more specific questions, so let me... so you asked about the measurement of distribution of wealth in UK. In the UK and in every country, there are big problems with the measurement of wealth inequality. So in particular, if you use household survey, you underestimate inequality enormously. So the result you quoted for the UK, where you have only 40% of total wealth for the top 10%, this comes from a self-reported survey information where there's nobody in the UK who owns more than £1 million. You have to know, does it make sense? You take any billionaire rankings, you can see that you have people, even the Financial Times, which at some point argued about this number, their own billionaire rankings shows that there are many people who are a lot richer and who have increased their wealth over the same period. So I think, it's important use the different data sources for what they can deliver. And the household survey with self-reporting information, they can be useful for the middle of the distribution, the bottom of the distribution, but for the top of the distribution, they should be supplemented with fiscal sources, with billionaire rankings, with, we try to use all these sources together. Everything is online, and everybody is welcome to contribute and to put online more data. And in the end, I think this is what can help us to make progress. So different countries in Europe have different trajectories. Well, of course, because they have different policies with respect to education, with respect to corporate governance, with respect to taxation. This is exactly what I said at the beginning. Different policies can make a big difference for inequality trajectories.
Okay, next. Yeah, of course, people who have read the book are the priority.
I think I have a very small minor comment on the research of enthusiasm in the beginning is that it is Ukrainian word, but you rather tell the word to my knowledge.
Sorry?
It is Belarus word.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Sometimes it is Belarus word. It's probably now it's talking about basically it's Russian word.
Maybe. I need to check. I have no disagreement with the exact origins of Kuznets. Yes. But if you think that's important, that's.
Yes.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. You work as a professor of sociology. I wanted to ask you maybe for some comments about, so you mentioned Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, in a way, benefiting from this system having had important earnings and return. And I wanted to ask you what you think about the discipline of economics, because this university certainly at the center of the teaching economics. And do you think this, I would like to work if you have also some thoughts about the possibilities to rethink the way economics is taught nowadays, or have you come from the direction?
Yes, well, personally, I view myself more as a social scientist than as an economist or an historian. I think the boundaries between economics and history and sociology are much less clear than what economists sometimes try to pretend. And I think economists too often, lose a lot of time doing too complicated technical mathematical models. I have no problem with mathematics. I come from a math teaching, and mathematics can be useful, but I think most of the time in economics we only need simple mathematical models. Maybe in quantum mechanics or astrophysics we need complicated models, but I think in economics most of the time when economists use very complicated mathematical models, it's just for bad reasons. They want sometimes just to impress other social science discipline. I'm not sure they impress anyone. Certainly they don't impress mathematicians or physicists, and I'm not sure sociologists or historians are impressed. But in the end, what I know is that very often they lose a lot of time. And I think they should spend more time collecting data, collecting historical data, using empirical survey. Still, you can do theoretical models also, but in a more pragmatic way, and in a more use models only when you really need them. Models are okay if you use them. If you use very simple models to explain a lot of data or a lot of empirical. But very often, economists use very complicated models to explain very little data, or sometimes no data at all. You can do a career just proving theorems, and this is changing, but not as much as it should change. And so, I think, so in Paris we are trying, the Paris School of Economics is a place that comes from the École Néo de Financement Sociale and the École Normale Supérieure, which are old institutions which were built more around history, sociology, or philosophy, or mathematics. So we are in a situation where, from the beginning, I think we're trying to develop a slightly more, it's certainly not perfect, but slightly more interdisciplinary approach to economics. So we have compulsory economic history teaching for all graduate students, etc. I think we want to move in this direction. But at the same time, I think it's not entirely the fault, it's not only the fault of economists if we have these very sharp boundaries within social science. It's also that historians and sociologists sometimes have let economists sort of take the study of economic issues and economic theories, and for a long time historians were doing a lot of work on historical evolution of wages, price, and wealth, and in particular at l'École des études en sciences sociales in Paris and other places, and I'm trying to contribute to renew this kind of tradition.
Yes, please. Okay. For yours, and then yes. Yes, let's go.
You mentioned here about the convergence of national trajectories. For one, income gap is growing everywhere. And you also mentioned in the very end that culture matters, that the narratives that people tell themselves about what's happening matter in terms of economic development. And I wonder, would you say that the convergence of national narratives or cultural narratives is happening as well? That, for instance, there is a kind of growing acceptance of inevitability with which this income gap appears. So that basically people are okay about the fact that the rich are rich and poor remain poor.
Well, I think it's more complicated than that. I think you still have national specificities in sort of these grand narratives about inequality and growth and development, but I think you're partly right that there is certainly we live at a time where there is convergence in some forms of ideological justification of inequality. What's interesting about discourse on inequality is that everybody at least is trying to pretend or to defend the common interest. So even the rich would never say, okay, we want to have less tax because the poor are poor, they will be poorer, I will be richer, and that's it. They will always say, no, we want to have less tax because in the end this will be in the interest of the poor. We will have more innovation, more growth. And sometimes it's right, and sometimes it's wrong. And I think it's important to put these claims under public scrutiny, but at the same time to take them seriously, because they always, if they were completely unplausible, they would not fly. So I think each country is trying to still to learn from its own experience by looking at others, and so you have these powerful convergence forces sort of imposing common narratives, but there are differences across countries. Look, it's clear that in post-communist countries like Russia and China, there has been a big historical trauma after communism, to say the least, and in particular this has induced very strong and extreme reaction against any form of egalitarianism or redistribution, and you can see that with this complete refusal of progressive taxation. In Russia, where you have 13% income tax, no inheritance tax, but also in China, what's happening in East Asia these days, is very interesting, because China is basically the only country where there's no inheritance tax, whereas in the capitalist countries like Taiwan or Japan or Korea, they all have a pretty big tax on inheritance. And so this is getting a problem, because billionaires from Taiwan or Korea prefer to go to communist China, because here at least you can transmit property without a tax. And this is getting a bit crazy. So at some point, I think so when you talk to Chinese Communist Party officials about this, they say, well, yes, we're going to introduce a tax on inheritance very soon, but I think they still feel that they can better control the distribution of wealth through direct means, you know, putting billionaires in jail is an extreme way, but there are other ways, you know, in the way you deal with privatization and the rights to control such companies. But I think it is an illusion. In the end, they will lose control and they will have a lot of foreign capital flight, a little bit like what has happened also to some extent in this country, in Russia. But I guess here, you know, it will, you know, I don't know how much time it will take for countries like Russia and China to start accepting the view that, you know, okay, we have moved away from, you know, Stalinian or Maoist communism, but still we want some form of regulation of inequality, we want progressive taxation, we want... Look, if you take the fact that there are differences between countries, even with globalization in these grand narratives, is illustrated by the fact that nobody in Germany or Britain or US or Japan, you know, wants to get rid of inheritance taxation. You know, I've never heard, you know, Cameron or Merkel or, you know, Abe in Japan say, okay, we are going to do like Russia and China, we're going to have 0% inheritance tax. You know, that wouldn't fly politically. Okay, so it's you know, you have convergence in some aspects, but then the force of national trajectories remains important, sometimes in very paradoxical manners. You know, I hope we will, you know, try to sort of learn more and more from each other's trajectory, because in the end, you know, this is all what we have in order to try to do better in the future. Yeah, well, you know, starting from the end, you know, I probably spent too much time just with Balzac and Austin in my book, and you know, I should have talked about you know, other literature and you know, about Chekhov, about you know, if you think of modern literature, you know, Carlos Fuentes in Mexico is probably one of the best illustrations of how literature can talk about modern capitalism. You know, in particular, his last book. That he wrote a couple of years before he died, La Voluntà y la Fortuna, which is a story of modern capitalism in Mexico, where you can see, you can recognize, you know, the president, Vicente Fox, you know, who used to be a marketing director of Coca-Cola Mexico, and you can recognize also Carlos Slim, the billionaire who has clearly a lot more power than the president, who is just how does he say, you know, the tenant of power, but he doesn't have the true permanent power, which is the power of capital. And you have all these young people who are trying to find their way between, you know, money and revolution and sex and whatever. And this is, you know, this is like a modern Balzac in a way, because he has such a powerful way to describe the consequences of inequality on the life of people and on the trajectories of these different groups. So that's you know, very powerful ways that the literature can have that, I don't have that kind of talent, but I think, the language of the literature, the language of the social sciences can be complementary to express to express these things. Now, regarding the role of unions and it's in some ways you have a decline of unions due to decline of some forms of manufacturing and employment, which we will not return to the same kind of unions, and this partly explains why you have the rise of different kinds of labor market policy. It's interesting in Western Europe to see that in recent years we had introduction of national minimum wage in two important countries, Britain and Germany, who didn't have national minimum wage until 10, 15 years ago, partly as a response to the decline of unions. So they thought, this used to be done by unions through collective bargaining, and now that unions are doing less of it, so the national government policies through national minimum wage is sort of taking over. And you also see that in Brazil, rising minimum wage has played an important role. In South Africa, there's a big debate right now, and probably they will introduce the national minimum wage next year. Now, this is not saying that national minimum wage and direct regulation of wages by law can replace unions. I think unions still have a very strong role to play. In particular, I referred a little bit to co-determination. In Sweden, in Germany, you have a big share of the board members in companies who are worker representative, and I think in the end this contributes to the high productivity of the Swedish and German manufacturing sector and economy in general. And I think these are issues also to discuss for the future. I think sometimes we are too influenced by only one model of organizing capitalism, which is the US model, and which is an interesting model from which there's a lot to learn, but this is not the only one.
Thank you for that. I want to continue the question about black force, the remaining force. Can we say that despite the attempts of aggressive possession and the effects on inheritance, the countries go to the road of inequality, and to this road of inequality create the social demand for great wars and revolutions in the future. And the main question is if the representation and the effects on inheritance fails, what have economists to offer the society as the model for regulation of the inequality? Thank you.
I think extreme inequality can indeed, trigger wars and revolution, and I think this is what we have seen in the past, and I think the very extreme concentration of wealth and income that you have in pretty much every European society until World War I contributed to the very large social and political tensions in Europe of the time. And in the end, it's only after these very violent shocks, the World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, the pressure put also by the Bolshevik Revolution on Western elites, that these elites finally accepted the kind of social and fiscal reforms that they pretty much refused until World War I. So historically, this has not been a peaceful and quiet transformation. This has happened through wars and revolution and crises, and it would be surprising if it was completely different in the future. I think crises and revolution of different forms will play a role, but does that mean that we need to wait for big shocks or wars or change to happen? No, I'm not saying this. I think we can do better next time, in particular by learning from history. And the circumstances, of course, are different. But I think the common point between the situation 1 century ago and today is that when you have very high inequality and you don't develop the sort of peaceful solution to inequality, such as progressive taxation, such as more egalitarian access to education, then it's very tempting for political leaders to try to distract attention for their failure and move attention to other things like blaming foreign workers, blaming foreign countries, and this rise of nationalism and tension is something you can see certainly in France, in my country, there will be regional elections in 2 weeks, and you can have the extreme right winning regions, partly because they just play the game of blaming foreign workers for the problem, the inequality problem we don't manage to solve through peaceful means, and certainly in Russia, the inability of the government to regulate inequality and reduce inequality in a peaceful manner, I think contributes to explain some of the aggressive attitudes of the Russian government abroad.
Thank you for your brilliant lecture, but I still have 2 questions. First, do you see any correlation between inequality and the rates of growth of GDP? And the second, do you see any differences in inequality between agriculture, industrial, and post-industrial economies?
Right, so relation between inequality and growth, I think it depends what level of inequality. So the relation is not, maybe it's not linear. If you have a very little inequality or, completely egalitarian, then a little more inequality can be sometimes good for growth. Now, if you already have a lot of inequality, then I think above a certain point, extreme inequality tends to be bad for growth. And so where is the tipping point? That's complicated. We don't have a perfect mathematical formula for that. What we have is, again, a diverse set of historical experience from which you can try to draw inference. So, for instance, let me give 2 examples. I think the extreme concentration of property and wealth that we had in European countries until World War I was not useful for growth. We had 90% of the wealth belonging to the top 10%. This was reduced tremendously by the war, the shocks. In 1950, 1960, it was down to 50-60% of the wealth for the top 10%, which is still a lot of inequality, but much less than in 1910. And I think, if anything, this had positive impact on growth, because this actually increased mobility. And, the problem, I think the evidence suggests that the problem with extreme inequality and concentration of wealth and income is that it tends to come together with very high perpetuation of inequality over time and less mobility, and that's not good for growth. In addition, it tends to create political tension and instability, which is not good, either.
I ask how many questions we have. 1, 2, 4. And let us open it. Yes. Yes, please.
Professor Steve, first of all, thanks for making this lecture happen. I'm typically high school economics, one typically in Russia. I'm very grateful to people at high school making it happen. I'm not a student, I'm not a graduate. It is a noble word about publicizing the knowledge. Respect the question, speaking about budget, and I recall the legislation from 100 years old, where one character is advising another who's a law school student that should drop out of law school and marry a daughter with her. That was advised at the beginning of the 19th century. The cabinet was so concentrated. And even the 21st century, with career studies, cabinets equal the same concentrated, probably more concentrated in Russia. What would you advise the young generation, the students in this room?
That's a tough question. Let me look. Yeah, no, look, okay. Yeah, my questioning about inequality and my work on inequality was indeed, partly motivated by reading Balzac, and in particular, this famous speech of Vautrin to Rastignac, so Le Père Goriot. So Rastignac is this very ambitious law student in Paris around 1820, but he's very poor from his family. And Vautrin is this very cynical character who basically explains Rastignac, well, if you really want to attain high living standards, education is not going to help you. Finding a good job as a judge or a lawyer is not going to get you anywhere. And if you want really high living standards, you should marry with Mrs. Victorine, who is over there on the table, who is not very pretty, but for a long time I was asking myself, okay, is it just that Balzac was obsessed with money? He had a lot of debt, a lot of private debt, and he was writing novels all the time to repay his debt, and so certainly he had a lot of personal obsession with this, or was it an accurate representation of the inequality structure of the time? And it took me a long time to try to get some estimate, and I think, at the time, indeed, if you compare, I have a graph in my book which I call the Rastignac dilemma, where I compare, how far you can go in terms of living standards if you find a top 10% job as compared to a top 10% spouse, or a top 1% job or top 1% spouse in terms of wealth, in the distribution of inherited wealth. And indeed, in the 19th century, if you really want to go to very high living standards, it's better to find a top 10% or top 1% spouse. Now, the situation today is not as extreme, at least in France. It's intermediate between the 19th century and the mid-20th century. The mid-20th century and the post-World War II decade were very special because this was a time when there was very little to inherit, just because a lot had been destroyed by the war and the rest had been nationalized and the rest had been controlled by public policies through rent control, which reduced a lot the value of real estate property, or progressive taxation of income and inheritance. So there was a whole series of public rules and institutions and major historical events, which implied there was little to inherit in the 50s, 60s. Today, the total volume of inheritance is close to what we had in the 19th century, but the concentration is less extreme. So today, you would have less people as a fraction of a generation that would inherit sufficiently vast amounts to just stop working entirely. But you would have more people that would inherit, in France, 500,000, 1 million euros, which is not enough to stop working entirely, but which is still, more than what half of the population is making with their labor income for their entire life. So that's a different kind of inequality, and probably the people inheriting, actually, they will go and study, and they will have at the same time higher inheritance and higher labor income than the people in the bottom. Now, in societies like Russia, with probably more concentration of wealth, although we don't have the perfect data, it will be different. And my understanding from some personal anecdotes that I hear is that, some of the wealthy elites, they have problem convincing their children that they should work, and this is apparently this has become a real issue, at least for this group of the population. But what I know for sure is that these things, change over time, and the view that we are just moving towards societies that become naturally more and more meritocratic, and where inherited wealth become less and less important over time. This is just ideology. There's no reason why you have this kind of natural, spontaneous evolution toward meritocracy. And there are particular historical processes and bargaining and fight and institutions that make this change over time. And the future can take different forms in different countries depending on the choice we make and the collective institutions that we choose.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the ideal solution, maybe about progressive taxation. I have to agree with you. well, they think that this seems to have to be part of the solution. They think that this is rather good, especially in the USA, where any solution to aggressive taxation, like the economic that's out of the they might want to have. In fact, they start to use trade policies, mentioned. So, what is the common system would perhaps recognize the value of progressive taxation, but would say, oh, we can do that, it's clearly different. It can't work in really existing capitalist systems.
You know, changes in progressive taxation don't happen just like this. You know, they need to happen. You need to have some political mobilization, some popular mobilization, and also you need to have some goal. And in particular, you want to pay for something, to finance something. You never increase tax just for the pleasure of increasing tax. So either you want to reduce tax for other people. So you know, in some countries, when the progressive inheritance tax was introduced, this was in order to reduce some indirect tax, consumption tax paid by workers. So this can be a way, you know, to make it something more appealing. Or more generally, you want to finance something. So you want to finance some access to education or some public policy which people feel is desirable. So I don't know. You know, in the case of Russia, I think, you know, one day will come where maybe many people in Russia will feel that if we increase the 13% income tax rate for people on very high incomes, maybe this will bring useful public revenue in order to pay for you know, better schools or better infrastructure or whatever. You know, I think this day will happen. Maybe, you know, sooner than people expect. You know, these things change quickly over time. So you know, the view that you know, this will never change. You know, in general, I think you know, including in the USA, you know, it can, you know, these things can change. You know, attitudes. I have seen attitudes toward inequality in the USA change a lot over the past 5 to 10 years. You know, every country has a complicated relation to inequality, including the USA, which historically was very afraid to become as egalitarian as old Europe and reacted to this. And you can have some other changes of this sort in the future.
Two last questions.
I think mathematical model can be very useful, you know, to clarify some intuitions or you know, in the case of inequality models, you know, the specific mathematical model that I refer to in my book is a model of wealth accumulation where the gap between the rate of return and the growth rate tends to amplify, you know, whatever inequality you have in the distribution of wealth for other reasons. So you have other shocks to the dynamic process of wealth accumulation related to the fact that people have different rates of return, have different shocks to their labor income, different saving propensities, different number of children, and whatever is the variance of these other shocks, the higher gap between R and G will tend to amplify these shocks and will tend to lead to higher steady-state inequality of wealth. And I think this is an example, in my view, of a useful mathematical model because it gives you that, you know, small change in R minus G, or, you know, relatively small increase in R minus G can actually have a very large impact on wealth inequality. So wealth inequality, it's not that wealth inequality will go to infinity, but it can get much higher for small change in R minus G. So, you know, this is only one, you know, like every mathematical model, this is describing only part of what's happening. You know, many important social forces and political and institutional forces are not well captured by this kind of simple mathematical model, but still it helps you to clarify some of the causal mechanism between specific variables and so, you know, even what I said earlier about mathematical models, you know, I don't want to you to believe that, you know, I have purely negative views on mathematical models. You know, I think if they are used with parsimony, some models can be useful. The problem is that very often economists are not very parsimonious with mathematical models, and then it can become a loss of time.
Thanks a lot for this great question. My question is actually related to previous questions about the possibility of producing and addressing text. Because the question reminds me for some reason about the quotes from one of the first chapters of your book about you jokingly, somehow jokingly refers to the possibility that the 7 degrees are going to my character, like essential, but something like that, but at least a year ago, I'm not like this problem. Anyways, so, what about the Saudi Arabia, India, especially Saudi Arabia, this, Arabian Peninsula countries? I'm actually having a hard time living in Saudi Arabia about to introduce, like 50%, 70% inheritance tax in the near future. How can we actually see how convergence of different countries is important in the case of controlling this economic distribution? How do we control those countries?
Right, so, you know, I think in the end, you know, the political choice of redistribution, progressive taxation, you know, depends on ideology, depends also on the political institutions themselves. So then, you know, so I think you mentioned Saudi Arabia, you mentioned India also. So in India, there's actually a long tradition with progressive taxation of income and wealth. And it's a very different, of course, democratic system than you know, in Saudi Arabia or Qatar. You know, it's a strange political equilibrium. You know, in some of the countries in the regions, you know, you have many people who work in these countries but who don't have voting rights. You know, who are just migrant workers and. So, you know, in a way, it resembles, it can resemble, you know, what we have in the 19th century in some European countries where only a small percentage of the population have the right to vote and were controlling, in effect, the political process. So, you know, these features of the political system, of course, have a strong impact. Now, these political systems themselves change over time, and they will change. And, you know, nobody knows really how the political structure and the political map of the Middle East in this case and the you know, petro-monarchies and oil countries will change in the future. But, you know, certainly I agree with you that, you know, there are deep political and institutional determinants to tax policy and to any inequality policy, which in the end are absolutely central.
Dear colleagues and friends, let me thank Professor Tomapkidi for this very stimulating presentation. Of course, our congratulations with the Russian edition of your book. Let us also believe that on some day Russia will be added to your database and to your study, and there will be plenty of systematic, transparent and comparable data here, and will happen a bit earlier than in 200 years. And Belarus, of course. And also let us hope to see you back to the High School of Economics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Not check the